Okay, welcome. In this video we're going to take a look at the script operator provided by Cebus in the TP startup called TP Initiator. And TP Initiator is pretty unique because it allows us to do things like Iterator does, where it outputs multiple values out of one output channel. It outputs multiple values per call or per time sample. So right now our master dynamic set to per frame, and so as we step forward one frame, our TP initiator here is outputting 13 values every time TP gets evaluated. So this is just like initiator works. And the reason this is going to be important is because we're going to go ahead and later, after this video, we're going to develop a spline sampler that's going to allow us to, based on a world step size value, to evaluate steps along a spline and create particles and get the alignment and use that. So it's not going to be exactly like this one, but it will perform this kind of function here. Of course, you can do this built-in with a lot of the built-in stuff in TP, but with a script, it's kind of a good example of how to use this kind of multiple outputs or multiple values per output channel. Okay, before we do that, there are some important things to know about the script operator, and I am by no means an expert. TP4 has only been around, or at least the script operator portion, for not even a year yet. So the way this kind of works is a script operator, or just an operator in TP, once you drop one out here in the work area, like we'll go ahead and disconnect this. So once we have this TP initiator, TP actually does evaluate and kind of initialize all of these operators. The way it does that is with a parameter down here called TP out ID. And TP out ID is we're used to it normally being used in order to check and see, hey, if my out ID is greater than or equal to 0, then normally what this means is that something is connected to one of my outputs. And so if my out ID is 0, it's the first output I have. If it's number 1, it's the second output I have. And basically this check here in TP calculate, where it says if TP out ID is greater than or equal to 0, then it means, hey, something is asking for my out ID 0 or above. So my output here or here. Okay, and so if something is asking for my output values, then go ahead and go through the rest of this and process that. But then there's actually the initialization case where the out ID is actually equal to -1 for the global initialization. So what happens is when TP first takes a look at that operator, it gets into the TP calculate function. This if statement evaluates false, and so it skips it and comes down here into the else clause. And then at this point, it's going to go ahead and do its processing. And this is where we're going to see how we can set up that iterator style function to take place. So one thing that we're going to need is a local variable. In this case, they call it out_num, and they initialize it to have a starting value of -1. And so what's going to happen is once we get into the TP calculate function, remember when the operators get initialized, actually we'll go ahead and disconnect this for right now. So we're going to disconnect that TP initiator, and actually we're going to add a couple lines of code in here to kind of help us debug and see what it is that's going on. We're going to say TP out ID equals, and we're going to add TP out ID as string. And then we're also going to say print out num equals and add out num as string. Okay, so when we evaluate that, we can see that just having this TP initiator out here, we get a TP out ID value of -1. So it's that global initialization. And at that point, out num is also equal to -1. Okay, we'll go ahead and comment those out for the moment. Okay, So when TP first evaluates, when it first does the global initialization of our operator, TP out ID is equal to -1. It's going to skip this portion of the logic, and it's going to get into this else clause. And there's some little description in here about how the global call works. But the important thing is that once we get into this else clause, we're going to say for I equals 1 to the number of iterations. And num iterations probably is bound to that spinner value for the iterations, which is this value, this spinner value right here. So for 1 to this number of iterations, we want to do this. We want to say we're going to set our out number local variable to be equal to that value. So it's either going to be 1 or greater than 1 up until this this maximum limit. And then so our out number now has a positive value above above -1. And so then TP is going to say, and then we issue this command, TP in out, recalculate the outputs. And so what that's going to do is it's going to throw us back into the TP calculate loop. And we're still in the same time sample. So this is still all part of our current frame or sample, current call. Okay, so our out number is now equal to a value of 1 or higher. We recalculate those outputs. We get back into this function. At this point, our TP out ID is going to look and say, hey, okay, well, in this case, I'm not being connected to anything, so I'm not going to process. Let's actually go ahead and turn these guys back on. Okay. But if we connect our number to the scaler, let's go ahead and just give us 5 values there. We can see that we're getting a whole bunch of values coming out. Let's go ahead and clear that and jump back one. Okay, so it starts off, the TP out ID is -1, and then our out number is -1. But then, once we've called that recalculate outputs, we are back into the TP calculate function. Our output ID, our TP out ID, can now look at and now tries to evaluate its outputs. It sees that number 0 is connected, so that's where our TP out ID equals 0. And our out number is 1, so which was set right in there. So that comes in here. Our TP out ID is 0, so it goes ahead and gets into this loop now. We say if our out number is greater than 0, which it is, remember, because we set it to start at 1 and go up to the maximum limit. So our out number is greater than 0, so in the case of our TP out ID, or whichever output we're looking at, if the TP out ID is 0, then go ahead and output that out number. So that would be whatever this is. So this is where we get that 1. Okay, and then we see here we get the next, you see, for 1 to the number of iterations, so it's going to just keep jumping into that loop every time for 1 until this limit. And so we get a TP out ID. In all these cases, our TP out ID is that. Let's actually also go ahead and add a iterations memory value to plug in there. And we'll evaluate there. Okay, so just looking at it again, we get the global initialization at -1. The out number is still -1. It gets thrown back into that loop, now with an out num equal to 1. And remember, it gets thrown into the loop using the recalculate outputs function. And so our out ID is number 0, and so it's going to go ahead and output that output number, which is 1. And then our output ID is actually number 1 also, because we also connected that iterations. And so it's also going to go ahead and output the number of iterations value. which we don't quite see there. Let's go ahead and bring up our debug. Let's step and clear, and okay. So in each case, it's outputting the number of iterations. It's going to output it, 5 times. It's the same number each time. And it's only really our number here that's actually any different. That's just how the script was made. That number of iterations value is tied to that spinner. So okay, so just keep in mind, remember when we create these this script operator for the spline, we're going to need a little variable here, local variable, initialized at a starting value, and then we're going to have to differentiate between that local out ID call, where it's 0 or higher for my actual operator, versus the global call, which is -1 for TP out ID, which is actually what we're going to use to start that whole iteration loop. And then you can also see here that after we've exhausted our number of iterations and calculated those outputs and gone through this loop a whole bunch of times, it comes out of the loop, tells us that our out number is now -1 again, and returns true. So okay, so hopefully that wasn't too confusing, and we will go ahead and next we'll go ahead and jump into creating a spline sampler, which is pretty fun.